Well, I first became interested in it when I played down in Hitchcock Woods a lot, a large area of woods on the edge of Aiken. And we used to go down there, and there were broken, like dishes all over. I thought they were dishes. And as it turned out, it was an old pottery. But we used to go down there and have wars with the shards. And that got me curious about what that was. And later on in life, I found out it was a pottery. A little later on, I was driving down the road one day and I saw something sticking out of a brush pile. And I backed up to see what it was, and I think it was a potter's wheel, I'm not quite sure, but it had 3 legs on it. So I loaded it in the back of my truck and took it home and figured out that it was a turntable of sorts and I could probably get it to turn pots. And I'd been wanting to try that for a while, so I got a motor, hooked it up to it, and off we went. Well, I didn't have anybody to teach me, so I taught myself. And I basically did it by just putting a lump of clay on the wheel, and it only had one speed, which was wide open, 100 miles an hour. So I would shave the clay off with my fingertips as it spun around madly. And I finally learned to center. And from that point, I started making little things. And then I heard about face jugs, and I saw some pictures in a book of face jugs, and I became interested in them. So I started making face jugs too. As that went on, I learned how the pottery was made in this area by reading the old Foxfire book. And I learned about wood firing and digging your own clay and mixing up glazes and stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of information in there, but it was enough to get me going. And that's what led me down the path. The rest was just trial and failure, and I sat there for 2 years spinning my wheels trying to learn how to do all this. And there weren't really any good books on building kilns or doing what I wanted to do, so I had to teach myself, basically. I had become interested in pottery, watching some of the potters at Rose Hill Art Center, and one in particular who was like the head potter there, David Stewart. I was fascinated when I watched him making pots and things like that and glazing the methodical way he went about it and loaded the kiln. And I really wanted to try making some pots. And I had that notion in my head for quite a while, and I was driving down the road one day and I saw this metal leg sticking out of a brush pile. And I backed up thinking it might be some valuable treasure. I'm always looking for those. And as I pulled it out of the brush pile, I saw what looked to be a potter's wheel. It had 3 legs and a turntable on it. So I loaded that in my truck and I took it home, and I thought, I could turn this into a potter's wheel if it's not a potter's wheel, which is what I did. I added a big AC motor on it, and the thing spun like 100 miles an hour. It only had one speed, and I had to get the belt tight with a hammer and beat it and everything to get the wheel engaged and turning. It was pretty primitive. But I made a lot of pots on that wheel. And I learned how to throw and taught myself how to make pots on that. And I made enough pots and sold enough pots to finally buy me a good wheel. But that's the story on where my first wheel came from. I started out using commercial clay. And there was a clay supplier not far from where I was living, and I would go there and pick up a bag, and it got where I was going through that pretty often. The glaze was a whole different ball game. I had to really experiment to start getting it down. And I also had to build a kiln at the same time. Well, there weren't any directions on how to build a groundhog kiln. So I started off by wallowing out a little hole in the ground, and it was pathetic when I think back on it, but I lined it with brick and everything, and I put some pots in there and lit it on fire, and then the next thing I knew, kaboom, I blew them up that quick. And so that was my hardest lesson to learn in the beginning, was going very slow with the temperature, letting it climb up very slowly. And I blew up a lot of pots, and they sound like cherry bombs or when they go off. But I filled up a big ditch out in my front yard that was caused by erosion with all my failures that I had. So I had quite a few up there in the beginning. I learned more and more about how the kiln functioned as I stuck with it. And I built a little larger kiln, and then I built an even larger one after that. And I don't know that any of these was correct. It was just what my instinct told me to do. And I'd seen a couple pictures, you know, in the Foxfire book. And so I tried to build something along those lines. And I finally got it down where I was getting stuff to come out, and felt pretty good about it. Yeah, when I started going through so much of the store-bought clay and everything, I thought, this just isn't being true to the tradition. You know, I wanted to do it just like they did it 200 years ago or 150 years ago. So I started experimenting with some of the clays around the area, and mostly the kaolin, which is a white chalky kind of clay that is mined in this area. So I started trying different mixtures of that and getting something that was able to be put on a potter's wheel and formed. Kaolin itself is very non-plastic, so it would split and crack open and when you're trying to form it. So you had to blend certain other clays with it to get a little more plasticity to it. With an alkaline glaze, what you're doing is you're mixing a glass maker, which is your silica or sand, and you're adding an ingredient in there that will lower the melting temperature of that, since silica melts at about 3,000. As far as the commercial glazes go, you could use those on this clay from around here, and I've done it before, but in order to stay faithful to the tradition, I mixed up an alkaline glaze. And it consists of glass makers, which basically is silica, sand, and something to melt the sand at a lower temperature, which is ashes out of the firebox of the kiln. And you take and mix all that together in a big vat, and you dip the raw pot down into that mixture. And you've got about 2 seconds before it falls apart in your hand. So you got to dip and set it down. Yeah, one of the big differences with this type of pottery is that it's once fired. Modern pottery is fired twice. It gets what's called a bisque firing, where you fire it up to about 1,300 degrees, 1,400, depending on what type of clay you're using. And then you glaze it, and then you do a glaze firing. With the Edgefield pottery, or the type of pottery I make, which properly is called alkaline-glazed stoneware, you once fire it. So I'm dipping raw pots that are just dried out clay into a big vat of liquid and trying to coat the inside and the outside and set it down before it comes apart in my hands. Yeah. The reason I'm so passionate about this type of pottery is because it was made here in the county that I grew up in. And as I learned more and more about it, I realized how special it was. And the whole fact that the slaves were involved in it touched me also, when I thought about how a lot of those slaves worked in the potteries, had to do different chores, not just making the pots, but chopping wood, digging clay, one thing and another. The whole thing just kind of grabbed me, and it just took me. And I'm just not one to make pink and purple pottery. I like the old-timey stuff, and this has an old look to it, and it looks like it's 200 years old when it comes out of the kiln, because I used the same procedure that they used 200 years ago. The whole thing with the face jugs, why I really like making them is they sort of draw you in, they pull you in, you know. You look at one and it's like it's looking back at you. And I found that real fascinating because I hadn't had any other type of inanimate object, art object especially, that kind of drew you in to that degree and that depth. The face jugs did. The first one I saw was at a little crossroads up near Edgefield, and somebody was selling it at like a little flea market, and that was the first one I had seen in person, and it just really grabbed me when I saw one. Seeing it in a book is one thing, but when you see your first one, and it was all cracked up and everything, and it was a reject face jug, but I wanted to buy it really bad, but didn't have the money to, so I thought, well, I'll make my own.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's beautiful.
When I make a face jug now, it all just happens kind of by rote memory in a way. I've made enough of them where things fall in place. I have a certain order that I assemble the parts onto the face. I usually start off with the eyes, then I do the nose and the teeth, and then add in the other components. And finally, the ears are the last thing that I add on. I don't know if there's a special reason why I do it that way or not. It's just the way I did the first one, and I've done them that way ever since. The face jugs that I make have kaolin eyes and kaolin teeth, just like the traditional ones did. They expand at slightly different rates than the clay, so you have to be a little careful. In some of the old face jugs that the slaves made, pieces actually fell out or came loose because of this shrinkage difference when they start being fired in the kiln. The clays just expand at different rates and shrink at different rates, and it causes stresses that the pieces can fall off. So you have to make sure they're attached real well. It's hard to explain how you go about creating different looking faces. They just, again, they sort of evolve. And sometimes you just get so tickled with yourself when you're making it, you can't stop laughing. You're sitting there trying to put the pieces together, and this thing is just getting crazier and crazier. I make a lot of traditional ones that don't have as much modeling. The ones that are the traditional Edgefield face jugs, the slave-made ones and the mid-19th century ones, don't have that much modeling in them. So they start out, again, a certain way when I add the eyes on. I know to put the eyes a certain distance apart. I don't know how I know how to do it, but that's just my look, and they wind up looking a lot like the old face jugs did. But I put the eyes on and just assemble it in that fashion and go from one piece to the next. And I don't draw anything out. I don't have a preconceived notion of what it's going to look like. They just wind up looking what they're going to look like. The ones that have more modeling in them, I do have to give them some more thought, because you're building up cheeks and jowls and one thing and another. So you have to put a little more thought into that.
So could you tell me a little bit about the first mention of face jugs, what they were, what Davy said?
Colonel Thomas Davies, who had a pottery that was being set up in Bath, South Carolina, a short distance from Edgefield, had a number of slaves working there. In their spare time, while they were busy getting the pottery set up, the kilns built, the houses built, and everything else, the slaves were allowed to make these curious jugs in their spare time, sort of off away from the main activity. But they had permission, I guess, to make them. And Davies was aware of this, and he remarked on these face jugs of how they looked and how they appeared to be something from the Dark Continent, aboriginal looking pieces. He was unsure of the purpose of them, but he did comment on them. And so he remarked on the crudeness of these objects and how they appeared to be with a real dark purplish type of glaze on them, which I guess was an alkaline glaze, in fact. And they were probably mixing wood ash together with sand or lime with sand to make this real crude glaze. This is the same glaze I presume they went ahead and used in the manufacture of objects that they did for the Confederate hospitals, which is what Davies' main purpose was, that and making refractory and fire brick. I think he was very accurate on the face jugs. We know that certain face jugs came from that place. They're some of the few that we have been able to pin down to an exact location as to where they were made, and they were actually collected from that pottery site. The slaves were allowed to make these things, according to Colonel Davies, and he was unsure of the use of these jugs that they were making. We know that they were too small for water, so they had to have some other purpose or purposes. They were very crude, and asymmetry seems to be the hallmark of them. The eyes, everything was asymmetrical on them, just a totally different way of thinking about a face than what the Anglos had been thinking about.